Welcome to Channel 24. Colonel Richard Kemp, former British Army officer and defense analyst, here with me in the studio. Welcome, Mr. Kemp.
Great to be with you.
Thank you so much. And, you know, I want to divide our discussion today for two topics. First, about the latest U.S. decisions, and the second part is going to be about nuclear weapon race in the world that's happening right now. So, straight to the point, the U.S. has just paused deliveries of some critical weapons to Ukraine, including Patriot missiles, drones, and, you know, precision-guided munitions, and someone as you with deep battlefield experience. How serious is this for Ukraine? Should Ukrainians be worried? You know, a few hours ago, the Prime Minister of Denmark, she said that it's not only a step backward to Ukraine, but it's also a step backward for the whole NATO. What is your take on that?
I think it's a very serious situation. Clearly, there won't be an immediate impact. Some of the suspension that the US has announced will take a while to take a bite. And meanwhile, I think, the Ukraine, the forces will have to probably husband and conserve some of the munitions that they would like to be using, obviously against this suspension happening. I think previously under the Biden administration, when there was a similar type of suspension of arms to Ukraine, the Russians used that to make advances. And so I think, unfortunately, we can probably expect to see them doing the same again when they're less under pressure from Ukrainian weapon systems than before. I know the Europeans have said they will try and step up their supplies, but there are some elements of the suspended munitions that simply can only be provided from the United States. So it's a pretty serious thing. Given that it may not have immediate impact or not widespread immediate impact, there's still maybe time for diplomacy and pressure from both Ukraine and Ukraine's allies on the US to reconsider. I think one of the issues that we should be aware of is that I don't think this is necessarily a punitive measure against Ukraine by the US. I think the US is taking a wide angle look at its own munition stocks. Because it's looking to see what it can and can't afford to supply to Ukraine. And so hopefully, once that review is complete, the US will decide to resume at least most of the supplies it's now going to suspend.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, the official explanation is that American stockpiles are running low. But, you know, Russia is now launching heavy missile strikes on cities, and it's a very complicated situation on the battlefield, as you may see. Why would the U.S. make this decision now when, you know, civilians are dying maybe more than usual in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think, again, as I said, I think it's part of a wider U.S. review of munitions. Of course, the U.S. has to take care of its own defenses, and it also supplies munitions to other countries around the world. And I was, for example, in Israel until very recently. I was there during the 12-day war with Iran, when huge amounts of munitions were expended, many of which came from the United States. And I'm pretty sure anyway, that some of those munitions were diverted from Ukraine to the US, to Israel rather. And whether that's right or wrong, obviously we can have our own opinions, but the decision is taken by the United States depending on its priorities.
Yeah, good. Understood. And now I just want to switch the topic. According to the latest CIPRI report, it's a Stockholm Research Institute. They saying, the researchers, that the world has entered a new nuclear arms race, and 9 states that are modernizing their nuclear forces. But the US and China, the two biggest spenders right now, and they are not actually directly engaged in any war. Why are they investing so heavily? Not only in the nuclear weapon, infrastructure, but all of it.
Well, the US certainly is under threat from various different places around the world, and its allies are, of course. And there's every reason for US and for European countries as well to expand and spend more on defense. I know, indeed, only a few days ago, maybe a week ago, the U.S. forces came under attack from Iran in Qatar. Okay, it was a relatively minor operation, but I think it indicates the threat that U.S. forces around the world face. And as to China, China obviously has significant military aspirations, particularly particularly in relation to Taiwan, and therefore, it obviously is going to increase its military capabilities with that in mind.
Yeah, because my next question was about China, why they so rapidly, change their own nuclear doctrine. What's the reason behind that? Because, they still have not enough of a nuclear weapon in there comparatively to other countries, comparatively to the United States and Russia. But still, it's happening so active. I think in a few years, Beijing will be, maybe one of the leaders.
Yeah, I think that's true of so many elements of defense, not just nuclear. Beijing is building hugely important ships and vast numbers of tanks at a rate that no other country in the world is able to match, and probably would want to match or need to match. But Beijing is certainly doing that, and I think it points more than any defensive needs of China. It points to their offensive aspirations, and of course, we've seen a kind of focus on nuclear weapons as a result of the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, with the US joining in. And I think, we'll see what the long-term effect of that is on nuclear arms races. But certainly countries in the Middle East like Saudi Arabia has embarked on its own nuclear weapons program, not necessarily directly, but making provision for obtaining its own nuclear weapons because of the fear of the Iranian program. Now, with that maybe pushed backwards significantly by Israel and America's actions, maybe that will take more of a back seat. But the nuclear issue is not going to go away. It's going to remain at the forefront. And clearly, Russia's nuclear capability has had a major effect over the last 3+ years on the West's willingness to give Ukraine all of the support that Ukraine needed in order to push the Russians back. There was that fear of potential Russian nuclear retribution if that happened.
And how does this new arms race differs from the one we saw during the Cold War?
Well, I think the difference is that the West took the Russian threat in the Cold War, which began obviously straight after the Second World War, took it a great deal more seriously. And since that ended, since the Cold War finished and the Soviet Union collapsed, the West has gone into a kind of state of tranquility and gone to sleep, in effect. And we've seen that played out in the extremely low level of defense capability in Western European countries. Now, maybe they're beginning to wake up to that now. Maybe. I'm not 100% confident they are. I think it's so expensive to go from where Western European countries, including Britain, is now, to a state where you can actually put up a substantive defense against aggression from countries like Russia and China. It may be so expensive that that it doesn't really get very far. I don't know. The problem is that Western countries have weaned themselves into total dependency on welfare spending, health spending, and all the other stuff at the expense of defense. So there's a huge gap to make up, and it takes political courage, I think, for Western European countries to fulfill that gap, to meet that gap, and I'm not sure that courage exists today.
No, really, absolutely. Mr. Kemp, during the 20th century, there was a deep fear of mutual destruction and mutual using of nuclear weapon. And today, many leaders speak more casually about nuclear issue, like, I'm going to nuke you, I'm going to nuke you, and, I'm going to nuke you back. Why has that fear faded?
Well, I think it's the passage of time. And I think, the only country I think that has, I'm not sure how seriously, but has actively threatened nuclear use is Russia. And we're well aware of Russia's totally aggressive intent. We've seen it played out horrifically over the last more than 3 years. over Ukraine, and also before that in other countries. So, you know, Russia, I think Russia's nuclear threats, there may be nothing in them. We don't know. I think we have to take them seriously. And of course, Ukraine exposed itself under international pressure by giving up its nuclear deterrent, which was, I think, extremely important and a mistake. And I'm not really blaming Ukraine for this, because Ukraine was working under immense pressure from the US and the West. And now I think there needs to be some consideration about where Ukraine stands in relation to Russia and its nuclear threat. And Ukraine does not come under the nuclear umbrella of NATO, very clearly doesn't. And I believe, and I've been heavily criticized for it, I think I've been threatened by the Kremlin for saying so, but I believe that Britain at least should extend its nuclear umbrella to Ukraine to provide some form of deterrence and protection for Ukraine using its own independent nuclear deterrent. I believe that should be the case. I'm not confident, again, that we have the leadership that would do that. I think there's too much fear among our leaders, including in Britain, where the Prime Minister, of course, would have to make the decision to do that.
Mr. Kemp, but isn't your nuclear weapon connected somehow to the United States?
Yeah, it is. It's theoretically it's an independent nuclear deterrent, owned by Britain, available to Britain to use as it sees fit. But we do have some dependencies on US assistance for that. So things like maintenance and supply of key elements come from the United States. And so that would be another fact to consider. If the United States president decided that it wasn't right for Britain to extend its nuclear deterrent to Ukraine, then that may be something that would prevent it from happening. But it's technically, it's still a nuclear deterrent. It's still an independent nuclear deterrent.
Yeah, Mr. Kemp, I don't want to speculate on that, but let me ask you, do you think that, you know, the thing that you are saying that Russia could escalate this war into kind of a nuclear exchange, I mean, is that a real threat for Ukraine?
I don't believe it is an immediate threat.
Yeah.
I think, and what I'm talking about here, really, I didn't explain it properly, but I'm not talking about strategic nuclear weapons being exchanged over Ukraine. I think it's more likely, if anything, that tactical nuclear weapons would be used. In other words, nothing like as devastating as intercontinental ballistic missile firing nuclear weapons, but lower level, lower yield nuclear weapons, which could be devastating on the battlefield. Or indeed if used against population centres. And I'm not saying that's an immediate threat, but it's that threat, I think, that deters so many Western European countries and that deterrence encourages Russia in its aggressive intent. Ultimately, I don't believe there's any other form of, people talk about security guarantees for Ukraine if it comes to some kind of an agreement with Russia eventually, that, you know, Western security guarantees. What does that mean? It can only really mean two things, I think. One is obviously setting aside the diplomatic and economic action that could be imposed on Russia. But the only other two things it means, really, a security guarantee means Western boots on the ground to back up Ukraine. I think that's highly unlikely. And the only other possibility is, as I say, use of a nuclear deterrent against Russia. I'm not saying firing it at Russia, but having that deterrent capability that has to be in Putin's mind in case he decides to, maybe after some kind of peace agreement, decides to take another bite out of Ukraine.
Yeah, you're saying about the Western boots in Ukraine is highly unlikely, but you know, when they created this coalition of the willing, I had this light at the end of the tunnel. I had a faith that they will come in Ukraine, maybe not to the front line, but at least they will be present on the Western Ukraine, you know, as a deterrent first. And now I see it's not going to happen in any visible future.
No, it's dissolved. It was never realistic, I don't think. Mm-hmm. I mean, Western leaders talking big is one thing, but actually putting their money where their mouth is another thing. And even frankly, in the case of Britain, and the same applies to other Western European countries, if Prime Minister Starmer wanted to do it, he does not have the military capability to do it. He does not have any longer, because our defense has been run down so much. He does not have enough forces to make a meaningful difference. And Putin has already said, when this was being discussed some months back, Putin was saying, any Western forces, any NATO forces deployed onto Ukrainian territory will be a target for attack. And that, of course, would scare NATO countries, including the UK. So I don't think it was ever a viable proposition to do that. I don't think, as far as I can see, I'd like to be wrong, but I don't think I am. As far as I can see, I don't think Western European leaders will send any of their forces to help defend Ukraine, even in the event of a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia to give some kind of security guarantee. I don't think it's going to happen. And frankly, and again, I hope I'm wrong, I don't believe that even if Putin decides to attack an Eastern European country like the Baltic states or even Poland or Romania, I don't think Western European countries are going to come to their aid. I don't think they're going to send their young men and women to fight and die in some Eastern European country that very few people in Britain have ever heard of. And I don't mean that disparagingly. I'm just being realistic. I don't think it's likely. So I think even though we have NATO, and even though people say to me, if you're right about this, it would mean the death of NATO.
Absolutely, yes.
It would mean the death of NATO, but I think our leaders would rather see the death of NATO than they'd see the death of thousands of their young men and women on far-flung battlefields. It's a terrible thing to say, and as I said, I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect I may be right on this.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, why do we need NATO then? And now you're answering that. Okay. But, Mr. Kemp, how much of this global buildup is truly about defense and how much is driven by political pressure? Because why I'm saying political pressure, because when I look at the North Korea, they have the weapon. But when I see the well-developed technologically South Korea, they are not into that process. At least I haven't heard about that.
Yeah, but South Korea, of course, is under the nuclear protection of the United States against North Korea. But it is you're absolutely right in the comments you made there, that how much is the military build-up real, and how much is it based on people's perception of a real threat? How much is it based on political pressure? I think in Europe, I keep saying Western Europe because I think we do have to differentiate between the Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And I think Western Europe is building up says it's building up its defences, Western European countries. I don't think that's really because they seriously think that they're under threat, or even think that they will defend themselves as they come under threat. I think it's all about pressure from President Trump, who's made it pretty clear that unless European countries start paying their own way, there's probably no US future in NATO, and that obviously terrifies them, and accounts for their kind of bowing down and saying, yeah, we're going to increase to 3.5% to 5%, whatever it might be. Whether that actually happens is another issue, but I suspect that many of them will be kind of putting some of this stuff in motion, which has, if you look at it closely, a lot of it has a long time frame. We're not talking about significant defense increases tomorrow or this year or next year. I think, if anything, they'll, and it sounds cynical, but I think it may be true, that they will be wanting to wind down the clock on President Trump's administration in the hope that they'll have a more sympathetic and less confrontational ear from his successor, whoever that might be, in 3-4 years or whatever the time frame is. So I just feel that these promises may not amount to what they perhaps seem to be.
Yeah. And, some experts argue that nuclear weapons make countries safer. Others say it turns them into prime targets. Where do you stand on this?
Yeah, I think it can be both. I mean, look at Iran as an example. Iran's nuclear weapons program did not make Iran safer. It turned it into a prime target for attack by Israel and the United States before it actually got to the point of having nuclear weapons. Had it got to that point, which obviously was everybody's fear, that it would not only would those nuclear weapons threaten Israel, threaten Arab countries in the Middle East and ultimately threaten the world, but they would also deter us. So whatever Iran did, it would be pretty much invulnerable to pretty much any form of attack if it threatened its own nuclear retaliation. And when you look at a country like Iran, it's not like China, it's not like Russia. I think, although we know how bad both of those countries are, there is a degree of some responsibility in their leadership. They don't necessarily want to see their own countries decimated by nuclear retaliation, and that acts obviously as a deterrent to them. I don't think that applies to Iran. I think frankly, Iran would be happy to see a large chunk of its population annihilated by nuclear retaliation if they could achieve the destruction of Israel in a first strike by Iran. So I think the reality depends on the leadership of those countries. And if you take North Korea as another example, I don't think North Korea has a very responsible leadership in this context. But of course, North Korea is heavily influenced by China. And it may be that if North Korea decided it wanted to launch some kind of nuclear strike, I think there's every likelihood that China would restrain it from doing so.
And also, I hear a lot about hypersonic weapons. Are they a real shift in warfare or just a mirror reaction to each other?
Well, I think that it's part of a continuous process of development of weapons. And Iran allegedly has hypersonic weapons. I think there's there's disputes over what that actually means. But the Iranian ballistic missile arsenal, which was huge, achieved very little because Israel had very, very effective defenses against them, which meant that they intercepted something like 90% of them. So I think that it's not a new thing. It's obviously a concerning development, but then each country is well aware of these threats and hopefully will develop their responses to them. So it's like pretty much every other aspect of warfare. There's nothing really much new about it. Even cyber warfare, for example, is not new. It's been going on pretty much since there was ever any electronic communications, which goes back many years. But the way it's actually implemented, the way that the effectiveness it can have and the damage it can do increases. And I think that applies also to such things as hypersonic weapons.
Yeah, you mentioned about cyber attacks and cyber war. And I was thinking, what about the artificial intelligence and how dangerous is the role of it in the future nuclear command and control?
Well, I think artificial intelligence, obviously depending on which country's using it, whether it's your country or our country or Russia or whatever it is, that dictates the level of danger to us. But I think artificial intelligence is an important development in warfare. And again, going back to the most recent, apart from what's going on in Ukraine, the most recent war that's been fought, artificial intelligence played a big role, certainly in Israel's very effective offensive operations and defensive operations against Iran. So, as I say, it depends which side. I think both sides obviously have and utilize artificial intelligence. You can either look at it as a greater danger or a greater asset to our defenses.
Yeah, and finally, I'm worried about the air defense in Ukraine. The latest days, we hear a lot from Ukrainian war experts that air defense in Ukraine dangerously thin, especially around Kyiv. Would you agree with that? And do our capital of Ukraine is still protected?
Yeah, I've been in Kyiv and other cities in Ukraine when they've been attacked by Iranian-supplied drones fired by Russia and also by ballistic missiles. And I've been actually deeply impressed during the time I've been there with the extent of Ukraine's defenses. And that, of course, includes not only defense systems supplied by Ukraine's allies, but also increasingly, I think we're seeing far more effective self-made Ukrainian defense systems. So I haven't been there for a few months or for a few weeks now to Ukraine. I was there a few weeks ago. And I, of course, monitor what's going on and keep abreast of things. But I don't think cities like Kyiv and other cities in Ukraine are undefended. I think things like the US suspension of munitions will expose those cities more. But of course, there's this balance between what Russia is willing and able to throw at Ukrainian cities and how effective the defenses are. And let's just hope that the defenses keep up with the offensive capability. That's not a great answer to your question, I'm afraid, but I think it's I certainly don't see your cities now as being undefended. And I hope that continues that way.
No, I'm trying to say realistic. I dream that someday Ukraine will find a way to create such an air defense as effective as American one.
Yeah, I think, and probably the most effective air defense systems, country for air defense in the world today is Israel. And we've just seen that demonstrated. And I hope that there is some degree, at least, of sharing technology and sharing information between Israel and Ukraine, which could be hugely beneficial for Ukraine.
Do you think so? Israel is much, much smaller than Ukraine.
It's much, much smaller than most countries in the world, but it still has the most powerful defense.
I know, yes.
Air defense system, and the reason for that is because back in 1991, Saddam Hussein fired 42 Scud missiles into Israel, and since that time, Israel has been working and putting huge investment into defending itself. It's been attacked from many different countries by missiles. About 7 countries have attacked Israel since this current war began. And so, Israel, I don't think any country in the world, and the other advantage Israel has, of course, in its defenses, apart from its very, very sophisticated technology that's developed over many years, is it's a very small country. And it's much easier to defend a small country than it is a big country. I don't kind of undermine Israel's capabilities there, but it's not like defending a country as huge as Ukraine. That takes a lot more, many more cities, many more big cities that are under threat from Russia than the cities in Israel that are under threat from many other different places around the world. But I do think that, obviously there are political issues between Israel and Russia and Israel and Ukraine, but I would certainly hope that there will be, maybe behind the scenes, there is a lot more cooperation going on between Israel and Ukraine than we know about.
Yeah, thank you for helping with my comment. Yeah, I am not undermining the capabilities of the Israel. I just meant that the size of this country is much smaller. But now we're understood. Yeah, well, if our collaboration will bring us a lot of results and will protect our cities in the best possible way, I will be very happy.
I think we could do with it as well in Britain, because although we haven't come under missile attacks since 1944, which was when the Germans were firing V-1 rockets and V-2 rockets at us, we haven't come under missile attacks since then. We are in range in Britain of Russian ballistic missiles and ballistic missiles from elsewhere as well, but certainly from Russia. And our air defenses are much, much worse, understandably in a way, but much, much worse than yours. So we really need to build our air defenses. And it may be, again, that Israel and maybe Ukraine can help us to do that. I'm not suggesting Ukraine should help us with our air defenses now, but maybe in the future.
Yeah, I think in the future, Ukraine will be interested in any kind of collaboration, military collaboration with other countries.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Mr. Kemp, for your time, for your brilliant and very clear answers. And I hope to see you again in our studio.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I look forward to seeing you in your studio at some time in the future.
Thank you.